Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Royer. I'm director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome to the school the former President of the Republic of the Philippines, Corazon Aquino. Prior to coming to the Kennedy School, I was the mayor of the city of Seattle, which is a city in which many Filipino Americans live. And I remember on the occasion of her election how very inspired and proud and lifted up were these people in my city at the prospect of the restoration of democracy in their country, and at the prospect of this restoration being accomplished and brought about by a woman who showed such remarkable courage and presence in the face of such what must have appeared to her to have been an awesome, awesome task. Her inspirational message throughout her term as president helped democracy bloom all over the country, all over the world. And her inspiration continues as the transition from her government to the next government was a peaceful transition in which democracy and order prevailed because of her example and her leadership. It's also a real thrill to be able to welcome to the forum a former resident of Newton. We don't often get that chance. During 1980 to 1983, President Aquino and her husband, then Senator Aquino, lived in Newton and spent a lot of time in this very place, in this building at Harvard. And it was undoubtedly a happy time for them and an important time for us to get to know her and her remarkable family. So it is with a great deal of pleasure that I present to you not only a former resident of Newton, but the former President of the Republic of the Philippines for an address. Please welcome the Honorable Corazon Aquino.
Well, first of all, let me just tell all of you how happy I am to be back here at Harvard, a place where not only my husband but my children and I were so happy to taste freedom after 7 years and 7 months of my husband's incarceration under the dictator. The rest of the world may be more aware of the pain and the glory behind our efforts to restore democracy. Few realize that with these exertions went Herculean efforts to reconstruct a broken economy. These endeavors yielded no dramatic images of nuns kneeling before tanks, of priests meeting soldiers with outstretched arms, and of parents with little children gathered in the shadow of the guns. The work of reviving the economy and setting it on a path of sustainable growth wasn't dramatic because it was not compressed within 4 days in February. Rather, it was sustained across 6 difficult years. Years of great sacrifices by the common people, of unflagging efforts under constant carping, and of frustrating reversals and redoubled exertions to make up for gains that were lost in man-made and natural calamities. But what these efforts may produce one day will be equally noteworthy. A country on its knees, able to rise to its feet and take its place beside the vigorous economies of Asia. How the Philippines was laid low and has tried to rise up again is what I would like to talk about with you, so as to round out the picture of my country after its better-known revolution. The economy the government inherited had 2 things wrong with it. The first was that it was the wrong economy for the times. The second was that there was hardly anything you might call serious economic activity going on anymore. The economic policy of import substitution protected once leading industries in the region from both competition and the motivation to keep pace with the world. By the 70s, we were outclassed in every kind of manufacturing. By the 80s, we were virtually out of the competition. People felt that it was enough for government just to control the smuggling of superior products into the country. The effectiveness of the Bureau of Customs became the yardstick of government performance. Yet, even by that standard, it failed. All this time, the agricultural sector was neglected. No effort was made to modernize it as other countries in the region did. Advanced agricultural research done in the Philippines was used more fully in neighboring countries. A naturally fertile country of 40 million did not think of improving agriculture to support a nation of 60 million and growing. In the mid-70s, the economy was hit by the Mideast oil crises. You experienced the impact on a big oil-producing country. Imagine its effect on mine. The veneer of Philippine capitalism, thin from the start, had been worn down to the wood. Now the wood was next. The structural weakness of the Philippine economy, its protectionism, its parochial industrialism, the neglect of agriculture, was as nothing to the 2 decades of plunder by the Marcos dictatorship in bringing the economy to its knees. At a time of acute economic distress, the Philippines had a government that was lending over 130 billion pesos to its friends to set them up in business. Among those businesses were the much-touted 11 major industrial projects, fertilizer, steel, whatnot. Only a few were completed. All of them went bankrupt. To give you a sense of what could be done with money of that magnitude, the total outstanding indebtedness of all the small farmers of the Philippines to a government lending program was only 5 billion pesos. That program was discontinued because of repayment difficulties on the part of small farmers, while billions continued to pour out for crony capitalism. This was a new addition to the lexicon of capitalism. It meant that a man without a penny to his name instantly became a major capitalist with money lent to him by the government at the behest of the president or by foreign banks on the president's word that the country would answer for it. A lot of the money went to Swiss accounts. Now, to be fair, this has happened elsewhere, but never on a scale so large and to a country that could so ill afford it. In addition to the crony capitalists, and occasionally overlapping with them, were the Marcos monopolists. Monopolies were ostensibly created to rationalize certain economic sectors, like sugar and coconut. Rationalization supposedly meant eliminating redundancies. Instead of coconut farmers or sugar planters and millers selling to middlemen and middlemen to the domestic and foreign markets, they would sell their produce directly to a single body. This would avoid the duplication of selling. But this also meant that instead of planters, millers, and farmers each taking his proper profit, the Marcos monopolists would take the lion's share. Admittedly, redundancy in profit-taking was avoided. This was when prices were good. When they were bad, the rule changed. Losses passed only to the farmers. This sounds facetious, but it is exactly how it worked. It is not surprising that Mr. Marcos and his friends earned the reputation of being, and I quote, smarter than others. Under this arrangement, the spirit of enterprise, which was never strong in agriculture, simply died. The cronies and monopolists did not pay the proper taxes, although they could raise the defense that in their time no one asked them to. Who had the temerity? In one thing, though, both the Marcos men who were favored and the legitimate businessmen who were appalled were agreed. This state of affairs could not continue. Something had to give. Since the Marcos people had no intention of changing a career of constant taking, What would give was the economy. Private capital from legitimate and dubious sources alike fled the country, thereby accelerating the economic collapse. In February 1986, we took over a country in deep recession for 3 years running, starting from the assassination of my husband, Benigno Aquino Jr., when he returned to the Philippines from Harvard and MIT. The central bank was exposed, window dressing its reserves. Panic spread among international bankers who reacted as though they did not know they had been lending to a corrupt government. The Philippines called for a moratorium and asked for a rescheduling of its debts. The chickens had come home to roost. Philippine credit plummeted. The bottom fell out of the economy. I would remember that cause and effect when I was asked to defy international finance on the foreign debt. In 3 years, the gross national product shrank by a total of 15%. Filipinos lost a fifth of their real income. Inflation surged and reached a peak of 63%. And then it dropped as the economy came to a virtual standstill. Everything was cheaper, but who had money to spend? 2.6 million workers were unemployed. The country was in debt for $27 billion. In the next 6 years, we would pay out $18 billion to service that debt and still be left with $30 billion to pay. That is how things stand today. It is said that the economy did Marcos in. No, it was his greed. The problem being economic, the solution we adopted was political. We took an inventory of what was lost to graft, less to fix the criminal responsibility as to learn from it. We devised controls to prevent its repetition. We appointed a commission on audit, so strict at times it would block developmental efforts. But we believe it is better to sacrifice an opportunity for growth than invite again a suspicion of corruption on government. A lost opportunity can be recouped somewhere else. A lost name is irretrievable. The strength of a government is in its reputation for honesty. The people will forgive policy mistakes, but not dishonesty. That causes loss of trust, which is the spirit of the cooperation so important between state and citizen. The Supreme Court was revamped. Only justices of integrity and competence were retained. New appointments filled the vacancies. We should have made a more thorough-going purge, but this was a sensitive area. It involved a co-equal branch of government. It was the only one left standing after I assumed legislative power for a year and a half. The parliament, which had proclaimed Marcos after the snap election, had asked for permission to go on existing. In exchange, it would proclaim my victory. But the people had already done that. To add the endorsement of such a parliament would have tarnished their deed. I abolished parliament. With such powers in my hand, I could do anything. And so I imposed upon myself the usual constitutional limitations on power, including a Supreme Court that could strike me down if I exceeded my self-imposed limits. Meanwhile, I prepared the ground for a new constitution and the elections for a new Congress. These acts seem like a diversion, but the Philippine economic problem had its roots in politics. Its industry was obsolete because powerful economic interests got government protection. Its finances were in shambles because influential men got government favors. The Philippine economy was in a bad way because its politics were bad. The two state banks that were victimized by behest loans were rehabilitated, and the policy announced and firmly implemented never to allow them again. For the first time, these banks would start remitting profits to the national government. Agricultural monopolies, including that on fertilizer, were dismantled. Fertilizer prices dropped 33%. Agricultural productivity jumped the following year. State-owned enterprises were put on the auction block. Many of them were not set up by the state, but taken over in foreclosures. So they were in the worst shape imaginable when the state began to run them. Let me say that the state ran them better than their former owners, but that could not change our campaign pledge to get government out of business. There was public apprehension of fire sales of these businesses and strong resistance to their disposal. But in the end, we sold off 2/3 of them without questions of impropriety. We trimmed the bureaucracy, cut back on government regulation, and streamlined procedures for government approvals. We stanched the bleeding, but had yet to heal the wound and make the patient strong. GNP rose from a negative rate to 1.5% within the first year, jumping to 5.7% the next. We removed price controls, but inflation remained low. That made us pause. It was both good news and bad, for it could mean that there just wasn't enough money in the system. We would have to pump prime the economy. The first and second orders of business were to restore Philippine credit abroad and inject some life into the economy at home. The first sent us back to conservative prescriptions. The second would reveal a new unconventional approach to development. The collapse of communist economies in Europe proved what we suspected, that you cannot survive outside the mainstream of progressive economies. We have grievances with the foreign banks, which had lent so recklessly to the dictatorship, but you shouldn't cut your nose to spite your face. The first dent in my popularity came when I announced that I would honor the foreign debt and take the conservative approach to the problems it created. This unleashed a firestorm of protest, but what could I do? Take the path of Peru? In the debt negotiations, we tempered our rhetoric, moderated our demands, but pressed hard for them. We fought to lower interest rates, to capitalize interest payments, and stretch out grace periods and maturities. We sought out debt conversions and partial debt condonation, all under voluntary market-driven arrangements with our creditors. The nominal cash flow savings we were able to secure for the country were substantial, but every step we took in this conservative approach stirred a hornet's nest at home. We persisted and obtained all the trade credits we required, a respectable additional amount of long-term credit, and all the concessional financing that we could use. I ended my term with a final agreement already in place, which would enable the Philippine government to stand on its own in the financial markets by the end of 1992, almost a decade after we became a rescheduling country. The debt burden was heavy, but the country had no alternative but to grow stronger to carry it. There was no way to shrug it off, as passionate advocates demanded. The debt was a monkey on our back, you might say, but it had the grip of a gorilla. The future of our international credit depended on how well we handled our debts from the past. The only way to make the debt burden easier to bear was to make the economy stronger to carry it. Creditors were certainly not going to reduce it. This meant having to observe strict fiscal discipline and keep budget deficits within prudent levels, a way of ensuring that as the economy would pick up speed, inflation would not spin it out of control. Despite the hue and cry at every step of the way, despite delays caused by democratic debate, we made significant strides towards our fiscal objectives. Towards the end of my term, the deficit to GDP ratio held at a conservative 2.5%. The tax revenue to GDP ratio had risen to close to 15%, from less than 11% in early 1986. Tax collection efficiency measures were in place, and serious tax reform was underway. Not all our fiscal measures passed Congress, but the top priority we were giving the fiscal issue was evident to our foreign creditors and the international community. We weren't rich, but we were dependable. We were a good credit again. But fiscal responsibility meant cutting back on basic services to the public. We wouldn't get a free ride. Although we had expectations of it at the beginning because of the goodwill generated by the dramatic quality of our people power revolution, we didn't hold our breath long. The strengthening of the economy followed a broad liberalization program. This was risky but necessary. The economy was weak, yet we opened it up to international competition. It had to be done sooner or later. Philippine businesses asked if we could buy time for them, but time didn't seem to bring industrial improvement. Better now than never, we decided and opened up the economy. First was the foreign exchange market, where controls for the free movement of foreign exchange were removed. The program was completed within 60 days after my term. Second, we put in place a 3-year program of reducing the average tariff rate and simplifying the tariff structure. We decided on this two-pronged program at probably the most uncongenial period for radical reform in Philippine history, at a time when we were deep into a stringent stabilization program. But we wanted to send out the signals that a major reorientation towards exports would not wait for better times. The signals were received only too well. Confidence in the Philippine peso got such a strong boost that it has appreciated so strongly to the dollar that the export sector has threatened to stop exporting. It has asked the Philippine government to protect the dollar. A Foreign Investments Act has increased allowable foreign equity in more areas of the economy. We would open the door wider to foreign investments if the Constitution allowed it. But we have convinced the public that foreign investments in the local economy do not mean a reduction of national sovereignty. Wider access will follow. Within 2 years of my administration, existing industrial capacity was used up and power generating capacity exhausted. Additional power projects met stiff resistance from environmental groups. There remains strong resistance to the operation of the Westinghouse nuclear power plant because of principled opposition to nuclear power and the anomalies connected with the plant's construction. Power outages struck. They had an extremely debilitating effect on economic activity. The silver lining is the unexpected discovery of large deposits of oil and gas. It is easy to miss the significance of the measures we had taken, especially since their impact has been blunted and obscured by the extreme difficulties the country had to face. The December 1989 coup attempt was crushed, but with such effort that investors until recently held back. The prospect of a return of military-backed authoritarian government and a resurgence of popular resistance were uninviting. A series of natural calamities followed. An earthquake shook the length of the country and cut off for a while the northern part from the capital. Typhoons swept the country, and in 1991, a dormant volcano erupted with such mass and force that its debris has lowered the temperature of the planet and delayed the greenhouse effect on the world. Before you thank me, let me say that lowering the lead content in gasoline is a better way to go about it. When I left the Philippines 3 weeks ago, volcanic mud 15 meters high cascaded through some places. These distractions notwithstanding, I believe that the premises of future progress have been laid. The economy is poised for higher, longer-term growth. Inflation is down to single-digit levels. Domestic interest rates have also come down, although they remain high enough to attract Philippine deposits abroad. Capital flight has reversed. International reserves have reached historic heights. The Philippine peso has become too strong. This will correct itself. In the second year of my term, GNP rose to 7.6%. The upward trend continued until the country suffered the last spasm of militarism in the December 1989 coup attempt. However, the smooth democratic transition last June 30, when I handed power to my successor, has restored confidence in the long-term stability of the society. The new government has started talks with the communists with a view to settling the longest-running communist insurgency in the world. I have said that the last communists in Europe are the exiled leaders of the Philippine Communist Party in Utrecht. I mentioned our effort to pump prime the economy in our first year. The idea was to send money down the pipeline to perk up demand and get things moving again in the economy. But some of the money stuck in the pipes, going to the pockets of lower officials down the line. A lot more was absorbed by the bureaucracy. It took more money to get money to the communities than actually reached them. It became increasingly clear that the best way to get government to the people was to organize them to come to the government. Thus arose the idea of depending on non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, to do more of the work of development. The most successful school building program was funded by the government, but implemented by NGOs in record time and with extraordinary economy. NGOs were allowed to carry money saved on one project over to another. Remarkably, this did not produce larceny, but an unprecedented efficiency in the allocation and expenditure of public funds. This is pump priming as it should be, a little money going a long way and producing two valuable results: a greater sense of independence and responsibility, and an enhanced ability on the part of the people to get things done themselves. My term, however, was coming to an end. After the February People Power Revolution, I came back to Boston to visit again the house where I lived so happily with my husband. I gave a speech at Harvard. It never occurred to me that I ever would. My husband was so proud of the intellectual tradition of this school. I spoke about the astonishing speed of the People Power Revolution. So many events were compressed in 4 days, from the rout of a military revolt, the tentative gathering of a few people around the military camps, to the giant concourse of a nation, determined to seize the occasion to be finally free. How it happened was explained by me with equal parts of history and theology, for the event was nothing short of miraculous. I might have regaled you again with the story of that exciting event, but this is the school of government, and not the school of divinity nor the department of history. Now you have seen that freedom won in the night when the dictator fled must wake up to the light of day and its long tasks and heavy duties. Then faith might sustain you in the long, hard pull, but only with work and study, and with more work will you get through. Thank you for inviting me here again.
Thank you, President Aquino. We have 4 microphones, 2 on this floor and 2 on the second floor. If you would like to ask a question, please go to one of the 4 microphones and I'll recognize you in rotating order. President Aquino has agreed to answer questions for a half hour or so, depending on how many questions there are, and I'm sure there are plenty, this being the School of Government. We'll begin right here.
Yes, what is your opinion of your successor, Ramos, and his leadership abilities?
Well, I don't know if you know that he was my candidate. I endorsed him. I'm very proud of the fact that he won. I certainly believe that he will follow through with our programs, especially the economic programs. And the reason why I chose him was that I believe that he is as committed as I am, to the preservation of democracy. In fact, throughout the 7 coup attempts, President Ramos was always there to support me and to support our democracy.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Aquino, magandang gabi. Ako si Zishan Zaidi. I grew up in Manila, and I would like you to know that my friends, my family, and I are all full of admiration for you and for everything you stand for. My question is this. During your term, you focused a lot of your energies in improving relations with nations in the region, as reflected in the ASEAN, or Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Now, with the United States military installations out of the country and Europe moving towards unity, what role do you foresee these nations, the ASEAN nations, and the Asian dragons, the more powerful economies, playing in the future development of the Philippine economy?
Well, even at the start of my administration, while it is true, we became that much closer with our ASEAN partners, but certainly we also look beyond our region, and that was the reason, in fact, for my making state visits to countries in Europe and, of course, the United States, and to Japan and to China, because as most countries in the world, we would like to reach out to as many nations as possible with the idea also of promoting more trade and inviting more investors to our country.
Good evening. My name is Walter Dean. I'm in the mid-career program here. I'm sure all of us agree you're such an inspiration to democratic people around the world. I wanted to ask, we had a lot of press coverage in America on Mrs. Marcos's return and her debating whether or not she should go and if she should bring Mr. Marcos with her. If it was as much of an issue as we were led to believe it was here, and the second part of my question is what the results ended up being, if they were what you anticipated or if they were not considered very important.
Well, first of all, the reason why I allowed Mrs. Marcos to come back was the case of the Swiss deposits. We had cases filed in the Swiss courts, and the Swiss court informed the Philippine government that before they would release the money to the Philippine government, it would be necessary for us to have a conviction or a final conviction on Mrs. Marcos. And I think it's the same thing in the United States, where in a criminal case, the defendant has to be present. This was the reason why, as I said, I allowed her to come back. Now, I think there was much more that was reported in media, because I remember some friends of mine and some guests to the Philippines thought, that the whole nation was just agog and so hysterical and happy to see her come back. That isn't true. However, she had very good, I guess she had very good PR people, and so that accounted for that. But the fact that she ran in the last elections, as you know, and I think you can see that the true sentiments of the Filipino people were clearly evidenced in the last elections, that certainly they did not care for Mrs. Marcos. Now, with regard to the body of her husband, when I was president, I said that we would have to study this carefully so that it would not be used for political purposes, or that it would not add to the problems insofar as public order and safety are concerned. I understand that President Ramos has allowed her to bring the body back, provided it goes straight to his home province of Ilocos Norte and does not come to Manila. When I was asked in the Philippines about a month ago whether I thought honors should be given to Mr. Marcos, and the interviewer in fact said that the reason some people thought he should be given honors was that he was a former president. So I answered, well, Judas was a former apostle, and I don't think he got any special honors for being that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, Mrs. Aquino. My name is Dean Yang, and I'm a Filipino student here at the college. And my question is about the communist insurgency in the Philippines. President Ramos has, in addressing the issue of the communist insurgency, has frequently mentioned that he sees it as a social problem and not a military one. And the government has been undertaking negotiations with the high officials of the CPP, Communist Party of the Philippines. Mm-hmm. How is his approach different from your approach to the insurgency, and what do you think his prospects, the prospects of success of this approach will be?
Well, it is not really different. It's just that during my time, it was necessary to go slow on this because we had problems not only coming from the communists, but also from the rightists, from the military rebels. And what I did during my administration was to have a program, the National Reconciliation and Development Program, where we offered livelihood programs for returning communist rebels. Incidentally, the anti-subversion law has already been repealed, and so the cases of amnesty that will be given to those who apply for them, not only coming from the communist insurgents, but also from the military rebels, I understand is now being studied. It is also important to note that the fact that we were able to restore democracy and to have peaceful and orderly elections certainly has made it easier for Mr. Ramos's administration to grant amnesty to the communist rebels. Also, the fact that he originally came from the military, I don't think the military would doubt him or suspect him of sympathizing with the communist insurgents. In my case, it was a different matter altogether because Mr. Marcos was accusing me before of having been a communist sympathizer. So the only difference is that during my time, it was better to start by having a National Reconciliation and Development Program where we would attend to the social and economic needs. I'd always believed that it could not be a total military solution to the problem. And President Ramos also thinks the same way.
Thank you. I see someone here. Yes, way up here.
Hi. A lot of NGOs, indigenous NGOs, have criticized you for your human rights records, and I would like you to speak on what you think you did for the human rights in Philippines, and also other policies like taxation or land reforms, and can you hear this?
Yes, I can hear it.
Okay, and the location of farmers and other villagers by the military because, in the attempt to rid communists.
Well, first of all, may I just correct your premise that a lot of NGOs have been attacking me. Maybe a few NGOs have been attacking me because I am working very well with NGOs. If you are referring to a report of the Amnesty International, this was a matter of great concern to me because the government, my administration then, was not given the opportunity to present its side. I had asked officials of Amnesty International that since they were interviewing complaints coming from sympathizers of the communist insurgents, I thought that it was only fair that government also be given a chance to present its side. I'm very proud of the fact that it is under my administration where the Constitution provided for a Commission on Human Rights. I think this is the only constitution in the world which provides for a Commission on Human Rights. I am very much committed to the protection of human rights, and in fact, we have given special courses to the military in order to inform them about their duties and especially to instruct them to protect the citizen at all times and not to do anything which would violate the human rights. So I would like to state here that we are very proud of our record insofar as human rights is concerned. And it is just that I do admit that there have been a few instances, but I would like to state here that this was never the adopted policy of my administration, and certainly government did its best in order to prevent the abuse of human rights. Insofar as farmers are concerned, again, it is under my administration where we had a law, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, which covers all farm areas. In the past, only rice and corn areas were subjected under land reform, but under my administration, all agricultural lands were subjected to agrarian reform.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Ms. Aquino. I speak to you as a student at the business school who lived in Hong Kong the last couple years and has had occasion to do business in the Philippines. I can honestly say it's my favorite country in Asia. But at least from the standpoint of a businessman from another country, I would say the Philippines still suffers an image problem as a place where it's particularly hard to do business, to bring in foreign investment from outside. And I think one of the biggest problems, at least from my perspective or in my experience, has been the perception that corruption is still fairly ingrained, well down into the lower levels of the bureaucrats with whom you have to work. Do you know if, first of all, do you agree with me in saying that? And also, if you do, are there ways that you think the current administration can address those, at least perception problems, if they are in fact just perceptions, or in fact, if they are realities, address the actual problems, maybe help improve the image internationally?
All right. Well, as I mentioned in my speech, we have done a lot in order to attract foreign investors and to address the concern of foreign investors. In particular, we have lifted all foreign exchange controls, and the exporters are the foreign businessmen who are in exporting are able to retain 100% of their earnings, which was not there before. Also, insofar as corruption is concerned, yes, I admit that in the lower levels, there is still corruption, but I am proud of the fact that under my administration, on the highest levels of government, there were no accusations of corruption. Perhaps a way of addressing this problem is to increase the salaries of government officials and employees. I don't know if you realize that our officials are paid very little, and in fact, when I was president, I was getting the equivalent of $1,000 a month. And my retirement pay is 3,500 pesos a month, which is roughly, my finance minister is here, how much is that? And ours, 3,000, about 200, how many? 3,500 pesos is about $150 a month. Now, in Singapore, I remember then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew telling me that this was the way they resolved or cured the problem of corruption. The salaries of government employees and officials were increased. However, as you know, Singapore is a tiny state, and it was easier to resolve that problem. However, we were able to change the fact that the higher positions in government were occupied by honest officials.
President Aquino, my name is Eric Azumi. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. And I was wondering if you could give us, military assistance aside, a comparative assessment of the two largest aid donors in the world. Basically, which was better for the Philippines, JICA or USAID?
Well, I have to be very honest with you. Japan is the biggest donor country to the Philippines. But of course, I'm also very grateful for what the American government has given. I realize that the United States is also experiencing its economic problems now. What I would like is for perhaps more trade and more American investments to the Philippines, which I think can help both countries.
Can I follow? My question was more about quality and style of aid as opposed to just quantity. Was there a difference? Or?
Well, I think quantity has a lot to do with it. You know,
Good evening, President Aquino. My name is Freddy Robles. I'm a Filipino student, former Filipino student. I now teach political science at Wellesley College. I found your speech extremely informative, but I found some cause for concern in it. Mine is not really a question, but a general observation. The program, as you described it, corresponded, I think, in its main lines to the program which the World Bank was foisting on the Marcos regime for a long, long time and failed to do so. And I would suggest that there's much less cause for optimism now that you have the political space to implement this kind of program, because definitely the track record of World Bank structural adjustment programs is quite mixed around the world. And at the very, very least, even assuming that the results which you mentioned, and I will not doubt the figures you pointed out, are favorable for the Philippine economy, what worries me is the way in which the implementation of this program, even the components of the program, has sort of been excluded from the democratic debate, so that even if there are sectors of the population who feel that they are suffering because of these cuts in public spending and so on, it does not seem to have an impact at all on the nature of the program and the way the program is implemented. I realize that this represents a different point of view, so I don't expect a clear-cut answer from you, but I'd like to hear your own response to this kind of reaction.
well, first of all, it was the Philippine government, you know, that worked out this program. It's not as if the program was foisted on us. And my economic ministers, one of them is here. Maybe you can castigate him for whatever wrong he has done. But really and truly, of course, I would have preferred more concessional terms, and certainly this was always part of my instructions to both my finance secretary and the governor of the central bank for us to get more concessional loans. But I think insofar as the economic stabilization program is concerned, this is something we have to bite the bullet, so to speak. But insofar as reducing the budget for the social services are concerned, as a matter of fact, with each year, and just correct me on this, it has not been reduced. In fact, it has been increased with each fiscal year. But I really am hoping that perhaps we can do something more about this. And earlier, I talked to the president of Harvard University, and I had mentioned to him that there was what they referred to as a debt for education swap, which I understand was done in Ecuador, and which I hope could also be done for the Philippines, being that we are very good debtors. So perhaps we could get some of the privileges and benefits that go along with being good debtors.
Upstairs. Yes, President Aquino. My name is Ted Cardsells. Sorry, we have a bit of a problem here. Yeah, okay. I'm very interested. You mentioned power shortages in the Philippines, and in fact, it's been a structural problem in terms of attracting incremental investment to your country. In my readings on the issue, it's not that the Philippines doesn't need the power. I'm just curious about the progress of tariff reform in your country, and also if you could comment a little bit about the Westinghouse power plant that you had mentioned. In terms of the progress, I guess your President Ramos has is addressing that in negotiations with Westinghouse.
Well, insofar as the tariff reforms are concerned, in the ASEAN Summit of January this year, we signed together with the other ASEAN heads of government the AFTA plan, which is the ASEAN Free Trade Area. And we have committed ourselves to reducing the tariffs at agreed upon dates. So there is a move to reform the tariffs. Then with regard to the Westinghouse nuclear power plant, President Ramos has, at least this was this was 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was there, he had appointed a committee to study the economic viability of running the Westinghouse nuclear plant, in addition to the safety of running such a plant. We also, in my last month, approved several fast-track projects. These were BOT projects for the installation of power generating plants.
These would be private power plants?
Yes, a number of them came from the Japanese business sector.
Good evening, Mrs. President. My name is Andy Bautista. I used to work with Chief Justice Fernand in the Supreme Court. When he ran for public office, I served as his campaign spokesman. Since he lost, I'm now here a student at the law school. At the outset, I wanted to let you know that your speech and your coming here made me real proud to be a Filipino. Now my question goes something like this. What are your thoughts regarding Filipinos staying and living here in the United States at this time? Would you exhort them to go back to the Philippines, or would you suggest that they just stay here, work, and bring or repatriate the dollars and revive the economy?
Well, first of all, I believe in democracy not only in the Philippines, but also in the United States. And certainly for those of you who believe that your place is here at this time, then certainly that is your prerogative. However, I think for those who continue to be Filipino citizens, perhaps after they have finished their studies here, certainly I would encourage them to come back to the Philippines, where certainly their talents could be used to help our people. But insofar as deciding whether you should stay here or come back to the Philippines, certainly I respect your rights in that regard. And I guess it would be a different case for Filipinos who are now American citizens. But for those who continue to be Filipino citizens, well, maybe you could come back and help our countrymen.
How many are there people up here? Let me just get a sense. If we take the people who are now standing at the microphones, why don't we do that? Are there any? Let's take these 4 questions then, and we'll start here.
Good evening, President Aquino. My name is Emmanuel Wakolo. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I observed that during your term, you survived 7 coup attempts. You've gotten quite adept at surviving those destabilization issues. I was wondering, what was your secret of surviving them? How did you manage to keep the spirit of democracy alive in that country? And if you have any nuggets of wisdom to send to the African countries which have been constantly destabilized by military coups and not allowing the democratic institutions to take root?
Well, first of all, in answer to your question on how I managed to survive, I always kept in mind that my predecessor, during the first coup attempt against him, just left the palace, and that was it. So I was determined that I would never leave the presidential palace no matter what happened, and I think it worked fine that way. Now, seriously, because under the dictatorship of Mr. Marcos, the military had been given so much power and so many privileges, and they had forgotten their true role, and that is of defending and protecting the citizenry. So early in my administration, what I did was to promote civil-military relations. I started out by forming an organization of the wives of cabinet members and the wives of the generals. I tasked them to take care of assisting the victims of calamities. And so they worked together, although in the beginning it was pretty tough because they distrusted each other. And I remember one military general's wife saying that when they were looking at each other over the table, one general's wife said, "Why are they looking at us, so angrily?" And so the general's wife responded, "Well, don't you know, our husbands arrested and detained their husbands." So in the beginning, there was a lot of, as I said, mistrust, but then I also decided it was time for our military cadets to interact with the university students in Manila. So I arranged for a 3-day interaction program, and the cadets came down from Baguio City, which is up in the north, and they interacted with the students in the colleges and universities in Manila. Again, initially, there was much doubt and suspicion on their parts, but just to show you how well it worked out, I think on the 3 years after I started this program, I was invited to be the wedding sponsor of the wedding of a military cadet and girl student from one of the universities in Manila. So it worked very well. So these were, plus during the last elections, I gave very clear instructions to the military not to interfere in the elections. And I remember after the meeting, after the command conference, as they were going out, one general was heard to have remarked, "I can't believe this, our commander-in-chief telling us not to interfere," when the natural way before was for them to interfere. So I think now that the military are very well aware of what their duties are, and also the fact that they are also very much appreciated now by the citizenry, their approval rating went up under my administration. I believe that we will no longer have the problems that I faced during my 6 years in office.
Magandang gabi ho. My name is JP Sevilla, and I'm a graduate student at the School of Arts and Sciences here. Pero magkapit-bahay ko tayo sa Quezon City. A great deal of disenchantment with your administration occurred with respect to the issue of land reform, which is as vital an economic and political issue as any you had mentioned in your address. Unfortunately, land reform you had not addressed at any length. And this disenchantment seemed to have been crystallized in the treatment that Butch Abad received from the Congress and the Commission on Appointments. I was wondering if you could offer a self-assessment of your administration's performance with respect to this issue, and what can be expected from President Ramos with respect to land reform. Can we expect some continuity between his administration and yours, or can we expect some difference?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it is under my administration where we have a comprehensive agrarian reform program. And I would like to say that under my administration, many farmers were given access to loans from the government financial institutions. In fact, I think a total of 500,000 farmers have been able to get loans from the Land Bank of the Philippines. You talked about a self-assessment. Actually, I gave a book to the president of Harvard University where I gave a self-assessment of my administration, and all my cabinet members also gave self-assessments of their administration of their various departments. Now, with regard to agrarian reform, it is also under my administration where we have exceeded the land distribution that my predecessor had done. Me, under 6 years, and his was since 1972, so 14 years. And I'm proud of the fact that we were able to distribute more land under my administration. But we believe that agrarian reform is not just a question of land distribution, but a matter of giving the necessary support services to the farmers. And we are doing this by providing them with the necessary technology and also by giving them the necessary credit support. I'm always very proud of the fact that Commander Dante, who was the founder of the New People's Army, was given much support from the Philippine government. And what started out as a cooperative of 500 farmers in 1988 increased to 10,000 farmers. What the government did under my administration was to encourage the organization of more cooperatives, because this was one way we had discovered of getting help to the farmers in a more effective and expeditious manner.
I wanted to ask you questions about the effects of the removal of the American military bases. It seems that the removal will have a large economic effect, which seemed to be what the focus of your speech was today, both in terms of the collateral economic benefits that are given to the economy because of the bases, but also because as the bases leave, the military and economic assistance from the states will be decreasing. How large do you think the effect of the pull out of the bases will be? Hello?
Go ahead.
And how do you think that your successor will deal with those issues? And what advice would you give him on dealing with them?
Well, first of all, I think you're all aware of the fact that there were two large military bases in the Philippines. One was at Clark Air Base and the other was at Subic. Now, because of the Mount Pinatubo eruption, Clark Air Base was rendered unusable, and so the treaty only covered Subic Base. Then, of course, we all know that the treaty was rejected by the Senate, by the Philippine Senate, and so there have been economic problems insofar as the employees or the people who worked at the Subic base are concerned. And certainly a great many of them were dislocated, and even those who were not directly working at Subic but whose means of livelihood were dependent on the existence of Subic have also suffered some disadvantages. However, it has not been as bad as we thought it would be, in the sense that Subic is now being developed in order to become an export processing zone and also to become an industrial zone. And we have been able to get many good a lot of interest coming from Singaporean and Taiwanese investors and also Japanese investors. So I am hoping that in time we will be able to create a lot of economic activity in Subic, and which will be able to help not only the people of Subic, but also in the surrounding areas as well.
This will need to be the next to the last question.
Good evening, President Aquino. My name is Gina Marie Lachase, and I am a student here, a graduate student at the Kennedy School. Actually, the question I had was similar to hers. I spent 5 years at Clark Air Station. By being a military dependent, I lived there from 70 to 75, and those years were remarkable years of my life, and I remember how beautiful it was to see the Americans and the Filipinos getting along so well. And so my question is, can you see any type of future role of the U.S. military there at any way, whether it be limited or at all with any of the bases there?
Well, in the past, I was under the impression that many Americans thought of the Philippines or thought of the relationship with the Philippines as being based purely on the presence of military forces on our bases. And perhaps that was not correct. At least we Filipinos did not want to think that that was the only thing that tied us together, or that formed the relationship between Americans and Filipinos. Now that the American military facilities will no longer be there, what has been proposed by both Americans and Filipinos is to encourage more people-to-people programs. Americans coming from the academe going to the Philippines, and Filipinos from the academe also coming to the United States. Also for businessmen to have more contacts with our counterparts. And in fact, I was approached by an American. He comes from a university in New York, and he was suggesting that perhaps I could also touch base with President Carter, since I understand that President Carter is very much involved in NGOs, especially in housing programs. And since I have also committed myself to working with NGOs, I thought that it would really be good if I would have the opportunity to meet and to talk with President Carter. So I think there is a move from a number of Americans and Filipinos to encourage more of these people-to-people contacts, and so that it will not just be the military bases which kept us, together, but more importantly, our love of democracy and also our desire to help one another, and especially the fact that there are, I think, 2 million Filipinos, Filipino Americans. I think that is perhaps the best way to promote this people-to-people programs.
Last question. Magandang gabi po, Madam President. My name is Mel Rican. I'm originally from the Philippines, but I emigrated to California 24 years ago, where I am now a judge. We Filipino Americans in California were very pleased that you resisted the overtures that you ran for a second term, because that would have been contrary to the Philippine Constitution. They asked my first question about the bases, so I'll ask you the second question I intended to ask you. What are your plans for the future, Madam President?
Well, as I mentioned, I have committed myself to working with the NGOs. In fact, before I left the Philippines, I was organizing women's groups to form savings clubs. This is based on the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, where poor women put their money together in a community fund, and they are able to borrow from that community fund. I have asked women coming from the better off sectors to act as volunteers to help in the organization of these women's groups. I have also, promised myself that I will finish my book. I'm giving myself a year from the time that I retired, and this will be my autobiography and also the biography of my husband. This will be my first book, and if it sells well, then maybe I would like, seriously, I would like to also write on the years of the presidency. So, and in addition to that, as I am doing now, I will be giving speeches in different countries in order to, convey to the peoples of the world what has happened in the Philippines and what continues to happen in the Philippines.
Any chance for your son running for office, Madam President?
Any chance for?
Your son.
My son?
Running for
office?
office?
My daughter is here, and I think she is showing interest. However, she is only 21, and in the Philippines, to run for Congress, you have to be 25. In the meantime, we are just, my children and I are all involving ourselves in programs and projects that will help the poor in the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you, President Aquino. May I just offer you an invitation on the completion of your book, when you're finished with that, in 1 year from now, that we'll make this forum available to you once again, and you can come back here and talk, and actually we'll buy copies of the book right here right now. You have a lot of friends here, and we hope to see you again, and we wish you and your family and your wonderful country well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.